and then they got a grant. Is at CRC-TR 224 from the EPOS Collaborative Research Center. So we want to make a big thanks to them, the University of Bonn, for that. And also the Econometric Society. These workshops and summer schools are part of fostered by the Econometric Society, and they have other sponsors: Amazon, Two Sigma Investments, and Google, who are helping the summer, not only these summer schools but many others in different areas. So these dynamic structural econometrics grew out. Just a little bit of a history. There have been a really good work by Ken Judd, and it was called ICE, Initiative for Computational Economics, started at the University of Chicago in the early 2000s. And then it moved to Zurich with Carl Schmetters and Felix Kubler, and it was called ZEISS because of the Zurich Initiative for Computational Economics. And Fader, Bertel, and I, Philip, a number of us have been able to participate in those workshops, and we found them tremendously valuable. But after a while, it was a big burden to raise the money every year at ZEISS. Carl Schmetters would go to big banks in Zurich to get money, and it's a very big burden to keep running those. So we thought the idea of moving a movable kind of version of ZEISS that moves around the world, where you do one year here and there. So this is now about the fourth year. The first one was done at UCL. It was hosted by Dennis Christensen, and it was such a good idea. We thought then the next one was in Copenhagen, and it had a theme of machine learning. So Bertel hosted it at the University of Copenhagen. Then in 2019, we had the University of Chicago. The theme was marketing and IO, and the local hosts were Gunther Hitch and Sanjog Misra. Last year, it was in 2020, it was going to be a theme of global warming and environmental change. Felix Kubler and Simone Scheidegger there, but because of COVID, it just wasn't really possible. So this is the first post-COVID. And let's hopefully, right now it's starting off really well. So let's see if things go well. So that's just a little bit of a history. So let's see if I can page down here. So first of all, I want to say I'm not an expert. We have some really world-class people who will be lecturing to you and at the conference. And this is not my main area of research. And so, and also, I'm 66 years old. My human capital is declining. So I expect to actually be learning as much from you. And this DSE, we're switching it around. We want the student presentations because you're the next generation of human capital. We're building on the human capital we got from our professors. My thesis advisor was Daniel McFadden, so I got a lot of human capital from him, Martin Weitzman, and we had a really good foundation, and we're just trying to pass on the baton and then learn from you and see all the amazing things. But we'd like to point out what the limits of our field are too. So in the spirit of Hans Martin, we want to show where the problems we can't solve, because some of those are the problems you're going to be solving and pushing this area forward. But so I'm just going to start by, covering some questions. What is human capital? Why study household decision-making? Do we need a life cycle models to study human capital? Are there other simpler ways to do it? This is maybe a little heretical, but are we taking the life cycle model too seriously, right? So I want to, I always like to be self-critical when we do structural work. And, a model is a model. It's not reality, but sometimes we act as if our models were reality. It's always good to be a little bit humble. And so there's methodological questions like, should we model decisions that we make as discrete decisions from a finite set, or continuous decisions like consumption saving? And then I'm going to go through just a brief tour. It's very selective. It's, what's really daunting about this whole literature is how broad it is, right? And to try to summarize or cover it, it's really, really hard. There's so many things you can do in this literature. And I'm always a little bit offbeat. So my own perspectives are not like necessarily mainstream. One of the questions I'll be asking are, I'm a baby boom generation. Is my generation saving adequately for retirement? And at least in America, there's a lot of evidence that we're not. A lot of people are not. The life cycle model doesn't seem to be applying, or maybe we just don't think we're very impatient as baby boomers. And then this is just speculative. I don't know if I'll have time at the end of this lecture to get to this. But I'm kind of a big fan of neuroscience and economics. I mean, if you think about human capital, isn't it what's in our head? And if you really want to say what measuring human capital, will we eventually, a structural model, be actually looking inside the brain and looking at the brain structures that hold the memory and our skills, and how do these structures evolve over time? And there's work on that already, and it's very exciting, because I think these are deep insights that lead to what we're doing. But on the other hand, I'd say we can make huge contributions without having a medical degree and being a neuroscientist. I think it's introspection in our daily life. We bring those insights into our models, and those insights are valid. And I think that's why modeling that we do at a top-down level is also really, really important. And then finally, there's a new branch of human capital theory. One of the students from Georgetown, who's now practicing online, Rodimiro Flores, working on robots and the whole issue about AI. And it's very scary to some people. Is our human capital being depreciated and will eventually be replaced by robots who does everything better than we do? So how do we think about human capital in this rapidly evolving technology, and how do we complement with our strengths the robots and the AI technology to still be relevant? So these are some of the topics. Now the last ones, whether I get to them depends on time. So I will stay on time. So I have till 10:30, right? Okay. According to Wikipedia, human capital is the stock of knowledge, skills, know-how, and other acquired personal attributes, including good health and education, considered useful in the production process. Now, actually, human capital is not just important for production and productivity. You might say it's important for our personal happiness and well-being and overall social welfare and development. And why are we getting an education? Well, we value ideas, right? And the power of ideas are our skills, whether it's a good skater or somebody who's really good at sports. That's also human capital, and it also gives you pleasure to have that capital, those skills. So these are important, not just in terms of raw production, but as I said, it's in a very broad topic. And, it can really potentially go through the entire life cycle, like how, we'll talk about how do you get your human capital? Well, it's handed down a lot happens in the family and early childhood. And that's what people like Jim Heckman and Orazio Attanasio, who'll be talking, are studying too right now. Flavio Cunha, many people in this area. So, and then it's not only the family, peer groups, your neighborhood, your schools. So this is incredible. And then where you work, right? What teams you're involved in. So these things all influence your human capital and have really profound effects on us. And trying to understand that is just getting the data to understand all that is very, very challenging. Now, this idea of human capital is really old. It goes back to Adam Smith, if you read the Wikipedia page. But if you think more recently, maybe the first term was used by Irving Fisher at Yale, but the names associated are particularly Gary Becker, Jakob Mincer, and Theodore Schultz in terms of developing this theory of human capital. So the challenge is that if you think these skills are encoded in our brains, it's really hard to directly observe that human capital, right? We think about even a physical capital stock, it's actually, more detailed to how do you measure physical capital. But human capital is even more challenging. And you could distinguish human capital that's encoded in our brains versus what's in books, right? We have all of this libraries full of our knowledge. And in some sense, that's human capital, but it's embodied in the words and equations. But is it really human capital if people aren't reading and remembering that knowledge? So we have to rely on indirect indicators of human capital. And the idea is that even though we're saying this is hard at first, even having rudimentary indicators, so we'll see some of the first models, is just looking at experience. How long have you been in the labor force as a measure of your human capital, right? Very, very crude measure, but it actually seems to be an important predictor. But there's also things like IQ and cognitive test scores. And then of course, wages are a indicator that we use that are related to your human capital. Now, whenever you come to this, there's always this age-old nature versus nurture. Like how much of our success is due to biological traits and abilities that we inherited biologically versus environment, like what kind of environment did we grow up in? Maybe you could have a great genetic endowment, but grow up in a very bad environment and be damaged early in life. And so that counteracts. So to what extent are these interactive and people like to try to assign 50% of success is biological and 50% is environmental. That's the kind of things you hear. Well, it's really, really hard to make that division, but we're acknowledging the interaction between biology and physical determinants and environmental. And then increasingly, there's a recognition, there's just not one stock of human capital, but many kinds of human capital, right? So if you look at the paper by Kuna, Hekma, and Shanak, which is one of the readings, the 2010 Econometrica paper, which won the Frisch Medal, by the way, they distinguish between cognitive and non-cognitive skills, like people skills. And those are different skills. And we know that intuitively. Some people are very, very smart, but we use the term in America, you street smart, book smart, but street stupid, right? You can't interact with people. And the people who can, also be book smart and street smart often have really, really good outcomes because they have emotional intelligence, right? Emotional capital as well. So it says an emerging, so just a quote, a large body of research documents the importance of cognitive skills in producing social and economic success. An emerging body of research establishes the parallel importance of non-cognitive skills, that is personality, social, and emotional traits. Understanding the factors that affect the evolution of cognitive and non-cognitive skills is important for understanding how to promote successful lives. Okay, so that's where we're going, into multiple dimensional measures of human capital. Now, that's Wikipedia is pretty accurate in talking about that. Emotional, you could call that non-cognitive, call it emotional capital. And then if you collect it over individuals, you have social capital, and it's a sum of social bonds and relationships that come to be recognized along with many synonyms such as goodwill or brand value, social cohesion, or social resilience for stable societies, right? And so when you have positive vibes interacting and people are supporting each other versus highly conflictual, conflict-driven, you might say there's less social capital, less trust, corruption, so on. Now, increasingly, whether it's a different aspect of human capital, but physical health is recognized, right? It's just obvious, right? You can't be very productive if you're not feeling well. And as we'll show later in life cycle studies, people in worse health work fewer hours, earn less money, retire earlier, right? Die earlier. And so physical capital is, physical health is really important interaction or a part of human capital. And again, I'm maybe quoting too much, but Some analysis complete good instructions for health with health itself, or good knowledge management habits or systems with instructions they compile and manage, or the intellectual capital of teams, a reflection of their social instructional capacities. In general, these analyses acknowledge that individual trained bodies, teachable ideas or skills, and social influence are different, and persuasion power are different. So, you know, and then there's finally, you might say, moral aspects. You know, how much, if you think nature and nurture, you might say, well, I got a bad deal. I got a genetic disease. I grew up in a bad, and there's nothing I can do. Or how much can, even if you're dealt a bad hand, can you change and overcome severe deficits? And, you know, we all know these inspiring stories of people who are severely disabled, who go on and have incredible motivation to succeed, right? And so increasingly too, a lot of human capital, a lot of our success is something intangible of human motivation. Why do you want to work? You know, who are your role models who inspire you to want to build up your human capital? So these are really, you know, how do we get all of these into our model? So, you know, right now we can't, right? But at least as humans, we can see all the dimensions and then think about all the possible really interesting topics that we could study in this area. And then finally, we do this a lot because of this understanding that we're trying to do is not just because it's interesting to us. It could have really practical benefits in terms of government policy to remediate inequality and promote human capital through education and training, family subsidies, right? This is a big issue in, there's an infrastructure, you know, $1 trillion infrastructure bill in the US now. And the fight is how much is human capital defined as part of infrastructure, right? And there's, you know, the kind of Republicans are saying, no, it's just bridges and airports and stuff like that. And the Democrats are saying, no, it's human capital too. We want to promote human capital, especially family, child care. And say, you know, when I come to Europe, I see a more enlightened attitude where there is much more of this family investment, right? Parental leave, right? For when you're raising your children, it's much more common in Europe. It's still not there in the United States. So these policies, this notion of human capital, really can affect policy and change things for the better. So we can say now, why study household decision making? Is it necessary? And, you know, it's just starting, you know, with this role of family, you know, it's kind of obvious because parental decisions on how and where they raise their children has long-lasting effects on their children's human capital. And this is really a major focus of the work of Jim Heckman, Orazio Attanasio, both will be here. As I said, Flavio Cunha, Costas Magyar. So there's one of the papers I included is a NBR working paper. I don't know if it's published, if anyone knows, but they say there's strong evidence showing that children's early experiences have long-lasting effects with implications for adult outcomes or even intergenerational transmission of human capital. So they're looking at family investment in India. And their results show an important effect of early health on child cognitive development, which then becomes persistent. Parental investments affect cognitive development at all ages, but more so for younger children. Okay, so I remember seeing this study. You know, there's talk about the plasticity. You know, going back to the brain. You know, as a babies seem to need a lot of interaction, need to hug them, hold them, talk to them, right? And you know, there's studies of children who are raised to kind of like in the Lord of the Flies on an island with no interaction. And if you don't actually learn to speak within the first 3 or 4 years of your life, you can kind of barely speak, but your speaking is permanently stunted. It's like there's parts of your neural net are open for development for speech communication that, if, you know, there's a period of plasticity where it can develop that. And if it doesn't happen, then it's a permanent defect that you have. It's not something you can't completely overcome, but it's a deficit. And also emotionally, there, you know, studies of children in orphanages, like in Russia and other countries, who are not picked up enough. They're just such an overwhelming number of little babies there that if they're not given enough care, they have permanent kind of emotional deficits that again could be overcome later in life, but it's harder. It's something. So these are, you know, evidence, you know, and so it's a little bit, you know, you might say it's kind of obvious, but it's modeling that is very complicated. Then there's a paper that I think Orazio is going to be presenting here at the conference Thursday and Friday, Thursday or Friday, parental beliefs and investments in human capital. And there's an important, you know, role of how the parent thinks about their child, right? If they think they have a dumb kid, then they don't invest. They say it's not worth it. Or maybe if you think you have a really promising kid and you invest a lot, but or do you compensate? If you have a child who has some genetic defect, do you work even harder as a parent to help them overcome, right? So I have a good friend, best man of my wedding, Moshe Bushinsky. They have a Down syndrome child, and him and his wife, Claudia, worked really, really hard to give the best education. And their daughter, Sivan, is an amazingly functional person living independently, having Down syndrome. So, you know, there's an example of like completely compensating for a genetic and enabling the child to accumulate human capital. So let me pause there. I said a lot, but we're then focusing very much on the early life formulation of human capital. So this paper, you know, there's something called the Heckman curve. And have people heard of this, the Heckman curve? This paper, it was very influential, that won the Frisch Medal. They find that investments in the early years are important for the formation of adult cognitive skills. Further, policy simulations suggest there's no trade-off between equity and efficiency. The optimal investment strategies to maximize aggregate schooling attainment or to minimize aggregate crime, or to minimize aggregate crime, is to target the most disadvantaged at younger ages. Now, I was on the, you know, as I said, the committee that awarded that Frisch Medal. And when we did it, we actually contacted not just other economists on the committee, but we contacted cognitive scientists, psychologists. They all knew of Heckman, right? So that shows that this work is very broadly recognized. But one of the concerns they had about the work is that this early childhood investment, it's like they just didn't want to get the message that it's, if you don't invest enough in the early plastic period, it's just a waste. That there's, you know, it's much, what they're finding is much harder to remediate if you have a really bad childhood early on. It's much more, so, you know, if you want to devote resources, early childhood is when it's got the highest return, when the kids are most plastic, and that's where you want them to have the least damage, the most advantages. But if they, you know, for whatever reason, there's a lot of bad stuff out there, you know, childhood abuse, sexual abuse that are lasting, but you can still compensate. But they just didn't want to say, let's not write off people who had these bad upbringings, grew up in bad neighborhoods, and say, it's just not economic to invest in them. And I don't think that's Jim's message either, but there is a recognition of different rates of return to investments at different periods in the life cycle. So there's a study by a Danish economist, Rushholm, is it the battle? I don't pronounce it very well, but in the Journal of Economic Surveys about the Heckman curve, using randomized experiments from Denmark. What they say is that early intervention has been a mantra in recent debates about human capital. Strong theoretical models motivate this focus by predicting that investment in children is most cost effective when they're young. So they do a meta-analysis of 10 RCTs, randomized controlled trials, including a total of 18 intervention arms and 30,000 participants aged 1.5 to 24 years, conducted in Denmark. And so here's the stylized Heckman curve here, where you think about age and the rate of return on investment in human capital. And so this is the highest in this early plastic period, early childhood interventions, preschool interventions, schools like high schools, and then job training programs. This is all before age 25. College would be in here. And here's the rates of return they calculated from this article, which is also in your reading packet, of the effect per size per $100 invested. And so that seems to be roughly consistent with this Heckman curve of the higher returns at the earlier ages. So there is empirical from these RCTs. But they also want to modify their message, and they're saying that interventions targeted at younger children tend to produce larger effects consistent with the Heckman curve. However, variation in the effect size within age groups is as large as it is across age groups. So effect size within age groups, so it depends on the kind of intervention, right? And that's obvious. This indicates that both quality and timing of investments matter, and that early interventions are not necessarily superior to later interventions. It's more complicated than that. Okay, so I'm going to pivot now to the next topic of, do we need life cycle models? So this theme is life cycle, human capital, and household decision making. And so do we need to have life cycle models? And in one sense, yes, because human capital evolves dynamically and stochastically over time, and actions, investments, as well as subsequent events affect how it evolves. So you really want to look at this evolution of human capital and how our choices affect this evolution. But do we really need, we're going to be seeing a lot of heavy duty structural dynamic programming models involving, so many decisions we can focus on, consumption savings, labor, leisure, fertility, divorce, the educational and other choices of parents and children, and other parental investment decisions. Do we have to have all of that in a single model? And we really can't yet. So you might say not necessarily, okay? So we can learn a lot from simpler, more agnostic models, but even those face daunting measure endogeneity issues, okay? So if you look at this paper by Kunin, Hickman, and Shannock, it doesn't estimate a life cycle model. It's really focused on a much more basic question. It wants to just know, what's the human capital production function? And it's trying to identify that. Now, that itself is really, really hard. Just, any life cycle model will have effectively, we're going to see a production function or an evolution equation for human capital, which is affected by decisions. And that's a key relation. You could say it's a causal relationship that you have to identify to get a proper life cycle model. And, and then there's a question of, do families know that production function? That's where beliefs come in. Or, do they have rational, we're trying to learn that production function ourselves. You can imagine families having a very fuzzy notion, maybe having wrong beliefs about what that return is. They don't estimate a life cycle model. They instead focus on estimating the technology governing the formation of cognitive and non-cognitive skills in childhood. So we'll go into that. So you don't have to have you can make a lot of contributions and say a lot without a full life cycle model. And however, the econometric challenge here is that the inputs to this human capital production function are endogenous, and often we don't actually observe them, right? We don't observe all these inputs. So they're partially observed or badly measured or badly proxied and endogenous, because the family, these inputs are parental time and investment, And that's a choice variable, depends on their beliefs and what they think about their children. And so that's where this is very, very complicated. So, you should read, if you haven't, already read that paper, it's definitely worth reading. So I'm just going to summarize here the nature of the production function. But here they have T periods of childhood followed by A periods of adult working life. Adult outcomes are produced by latent adult cognitive and non-cognitive skills. So you can use theta, and they just have a two-dimensional theta C at time T is the cognitive skills, okay? But that's latent, right? We don't have a direct measure of those skills. And then there's non-cognitive, and they're affected by parental investments, ICT and NIN, so non-cognitive and cognitive investments, like sending you to tutors or something. And non-cognitive schools might be sending you to a summer camp where you learn discipline and interacting with other kids during childhood. And then each agent inherits initial condition or biological endowment, theta 1, at time 1, at birth, you might say, that may also reflect family environment and parental skills, theta P. Okay, so right now, this is a little bit mind-blowing already when you think about this. And then you say, there's random shocks to skills. So now we have a production function that looks kind of like this. It's how this bivariate measure of human capital at the next period is a function of current state, investment, parental skills, and then random shocks, which may be serially correlated. And that's the thing they're focusing on investing. And it depends also on the stage of childhood, right? There's one function for, babies, infants, and another one for toddlers, and another for, and those of you who are parents know that, how you parent when, a teenager is very different than how you parent a toddler, right? And I guess Hans Martin is in that, the toddler, you're in the toddler stage, right? And it's challenging, and being a parent, you also realize, how many books on parenting can you and how do you treat, when your child has a temper tantrum, how do you deal with that, right? How you to deal with that, and you don't want to damage human capital, but also you don't want to have a spoiled kid, right? So you have, there's always these really hard problems as a parent. So they say that identifying and estimating this technology is challenging. Both inputs and outputs can only be proxied. Measurement error is in general nonlinear. Nonlinear specifications of this technology raise serious econometric challenges. Inputs may be endogenous, and the unobservables in the equations may be correlated with the observables in the technology equations. So these could be correlated with the investments, for instance. So kind of classic endogeneity in econometrics. So we don't necessarily need a life cycle model, but I think at the same time, of course, I'm going to be very pro on life cycle models, because I think life cycle models also explain this investment, right? The investment of parents, is something we also want to explain. We don't want to just treat it as something that we want to try to explain it and try to say, can we affect parental investments, and how would government policy or other training for parents affect their investments? And could we make better parents if parents know more about this production function 1? So then there's adding health dynamics to human capital dynamics. And so again, this paper by Attanasio, Maguire, and Nix builds on the work of Kuna, Heckman, and Shannock, and uses additional identification results from Agostinelli and Wiswall that is simpler and faster. So the inputs to production functions include parental background, prior child cognition and health, and child investments, which are taken as endogenous. And estimation is based on a nonlinear factor model with multiple measurements for both inputs and child outcomes. And they say their results show an important effect of early health on child cognitive development, which then becomes persistent. So this is using data from India. So we find, so this approach, despite all these challenges, is generating results and new insights. And they say that that health affects cognitive development, particularly at younger ages. The well-documented morbidity amongst poor populations reflected in stunting feeds into cognitive development, generating permanent deficits in both health and cognition. These results imply that early health interventions are likely to be an important component in any policy that aims to improve human capital development. So again, this is consistent with a Heckman curve that early childhood investments are particularly effective because of counteracting, stunting or scarring effects that are, particularly when your neural net is developing, your neural net is more vulnerable. And that's where reading cognitive science and understanding that development, and there's also, people take about teenagers, their brain is still developing, and right, teenagers take big risks, right? Because yet they, they're not, they think they're immortal. They think they can, they can survive anything. And then as they get older, their behavior changes, they're mature. So they're even into teenage years, the neural net is still evolving. Okay, so let's now pivot and just stay, I'm going to go now to more life cycle models. We're going to also look at the end of the life cycle as well, right? My end of the life cycle, right? I've been there as a parent. I have a daughter, and the great pleasure of my life was to have a daughter, and she's now 28 years old. But now I'm looking at the other end of the life cycle, and preparing for eventually retirement. And so there's many aspects of the life cycle model that we'll be focusing on here. But we have seen, a huge number of topics in terms of this production function, and there's return to schooling, and schooling is not just elementary school and high school. There's college, and then graduate. You're getting human capital here, right? And we're here to promote human capital, so we think about the wage equation to provide a model-based explanation and prediction of endogenous choices such as consumption, savings, labor supply, marriage, divorce decisions, fertility, children. All of these things can be, the life cycle model. You almost say what's not in the life cycle model. The challenge is how can you get enough data and actually solve a model that does everything that we do in our life, right? Our brain, and we'll come back to this in a minute, but in some sense, we're still woefully far away from being able to do what we're all doing through our life, which is every day waking up, making all the decisions we do. And our models are, you almost, when you work in this, you feel a little depressed because you work so hard and yet, your model's so incomplete, right? And you feel like, man, I really like to get more into my model. How do we do that? How do we do it? How do we get, through life if it's so complex? So, so that comes to the, the constraints that, besides, well, there's data is a whole separate issue. Do we have enough data for this? But, in terms of modeling, there's the curse of dimensionality, who I'm sure you've all come up with, right? And this is one of the things that we're hoping to promote, new ideas. How do we overcome the curse of dimensionality to get richer models with more stuff in them? And then the identification problem, right? Can we always explain any behavior multiple ways? So we're really not sure what people's preferences, what their beliefs are. And if we can't really, if there's multiple ways of explaining a given set of behavior, and they have very different implications for policy, then we're really going to be nervous in saying, well, all this research has clear policy recommendations about what we should be doing. So these are really major scientific challenges. And what I have to say is the identification problem appears the less you're willing to make assumptions, the more the identification problem is going to be a problem for you, right? And there are people who don't like to make assumptions, right? But I would say if you're in this business, you have to be prepared to make assumptions and defend them because the data is not just going to jump up and speak to you, right? And so you have to. Now you might say, well, how do I know my assumptions are wrong? Well, there's something intangible about the model building, which is we're brilliant in the sense that we know a lot about what's important and not, which is, you could say, even anecdotal evidence is a source of inspiration for both theory and empirical work. And it's intangible, but by encoding our ideas in a model, we're bringing to bear something intangible aspect that is a part of reality, but it's something that we have to supply in the model formation process. And that's the creative and the fun part of modeling, is taking our own insights that we see through our own work, anecdotes that we think are important, and saying, can I put this into a model and understand this thing better? Okay, and so that's where you have to justify, is my question interesting? Is my way of doing it the right way? And you see, when you look at the literature, you see a lot of people who are doing just that, but in the context of pretty limited models. So let's go to the canonical life cycle model. And you have let's just consider an individual. Later, Maria Cristina Dinardi is going to be giving a lecture on the importance of the family and the couple, modeling couples. And then when you have a couple, do you model that couple as a non-cooperative? Is it a non-cooperative game? Is it a cooperative game? Is there altruism in the family, right? We think there is, but just as a bad joke, I had a colleague who said the right way to model a marriage is it's a non-cooperative game, and that colleague is no longer married anymore. But in some sense, when you're married for a long time, it's a good marriage. You actually start to say, you're taking the utility function of your spouse into your own, and there's, we'll talk about the collective model and so on. You have your own preferences, but your spouse's preferences factor into what you do. And the couple tends to get a kind of a molded utility function where, your spouse often modifies your own, ways of what you like and vice versa, right? And you see this also in children, right? If a Fedor is an adventure racer, his wife is a championship adventure racer, and their kids, and I bet their kids are going to be adventure racers, right? They're exposing them to this. Now, sometimes it works the other way. You have parents who, who are academics, and the kids, they're just too heavy-handed with their kids, and they think academics is the best, and then the kids just hate it. They don't want to do academics anymore, right? Somehow the parents turn the kids off, and they said, I don't want to do this. And my own daughter, she doesn't want to be an academic. She's an artist, right? And I don't know where that artistic, she's both a musician and a painter and an artist. And I have none of those skills, right? I have no ability to pass that down. And so that must have come biologically or something, that those skills developed. But the best thing I could do is encourage her when I saw it, she had those skills, is say, go ahead and do that. Anyway, I digress. But here's the canonical life. There's a random age of death. I'm going to do this in discrete time, but you can also do these. Obviously, you could say we're operating in continuous time, and maybe that's the best. It's just that continuous time is difficult many times to deal with, and we have a discount factor. Here's the utility function, and it depends on some states. And, so what's in this vector of states, really differentiates different models. What do we put in these states? And these are the decisions that could include consumption, labor supply, collecting Social Security benefits, marriage, divorce. So lots and lots of possible decisions. And then here's a bequest function that you might have at the end of your life, in the random life. And suppose, in many models that we live a finite lifespan. So we have there's some upper bound on life. Then you can often write this in terms of a hazard function. So you can first define at the value function, if you arrived at the last period of life, then the backward induction is just to solve the static problem in the last period of life. And then if you define a hazard rate, rho, it could be state dependent. That's a probability, it's a survival probability. So given that you lived T years in this condition S, then this could affect, health could affect this, right? And your survival probability is a function of your health. Then you can write this as kind of like in part of the discount factor or a separate thing. There's a discount factor and a survival probability. And if you survive, you get a next period expected value function, or if you don't survive, you leave the bequest. So you could not survive, not just at capital T, but at some earlier age as well. And then this notation EV is a conditional expectation. And here, where we start to see some of the computational problems, there's a maximization and there's an integration over these states. And then here's this transition probability. And this is where, the causality, this is like where the human capital production function is entering. Here is the evolution, so if some of these states are human capital, and this is decision like schooling, then our causality is embedded in this thing right here. And then we have to think about, in this transition probability, is this rational expectations? Do people have a knowledge of this thing, or do we have a fuzzy understanding of this thing, and or subjective beliefs about this that differ from the reality? And so can we estimate these beliefs and the preferences in this model? That's the identification. And then, because Philip's sitting here, there's an issue of robust control. What, in reality, if we recognize we don't really know these things very well, is there generalizations that, this kind of assumes that, we're treating this literally, we really know this. But in reality, we all know that everything, we have a kind of fuzzy knowledge of the world. How can we start to reflect that fuzzy knowledge of the world and possibly learning that we have about these things as parents, right? And as we go on as parents, we make mistakes. Sometimes we over-discipline ourselves, and then we think about it and say, I screwed up. And then you change your behavior based on new understanding of this transition probability. Now, I'm going to poke some fun at the life cycle model now. I think it's always good to be humble and say, what's the shortcoming of that model? Because we kind of, sometimes when I say take it too seriously, I take science very seriously, but we also should step back and say, are we taking our models too seriously? Should we be going broader? Now, first of all, most of there's the Allais paradox. It's a laboratory experiment that was very, very convincing. That shows that, we don't follow the expected utility model. Okay, it's not everyone fails this test, but a famous guy named Leonard Jimmy Savage, one of the founders of subjective expected utility theory, they played this experiment on him and he got it wrong. And he was extremely embarrassed, right? Because he was promoting the idea that, this is the way to go, is that people have subjective beliefs, subjective probability, and subjective probability follows the expected utility axioms. And the answer is no, So, right off the bat, we're using expected utility models, and there's pretty good experimental evidence that they're wrong. They're not right. We're doing something like prospect theory is one of them. There are a number of non-expected utilities. So should we be, using expected utility? And then the same thing for discounted utility. We're always using the sum of discounted utilities, but there's a survey by these guys in 2002, Journal of Economic Perspective or Literature, I believe, on the discounted utility. And it says the DU, discounted utility model, which continues to be widely used by economists, has little empirical support. Even its developer, Samuelson, who originally proposed the model, and Koopmans, who provided the first axiomatic derivation, had concerns about its descriptive realism, and it was never empirically validated as the appropriate model for intertemporal choice. So, you know, are we really building a big superstructure on very weak, dubious foundations, right? You know, should you, you know, maybe you should all rethink what you're doing here, right? Okay. So, and then finally, you know, this assumption of rationality, do individuals really do what we're doing, which is the backward induction from, you know, you think about when you have a baby, do you really think that baby has popped out of the womb and it has solved their entire, they've figured out their retirement plan, they know which 401k they're going to invest in? Obviously not. You smile, you know, so it's bizarre. We assume you use this, but this is, you know, it's probably much better to think about humans as doing something more like forward induction than backward induction as we learn, right? We're making limited horizon forecasts. We are looking forward, but with an increasingly fuzzy future. And then we're reprogramming as we go on in life, as we learn more. Right? It's not, the baby doesn't have to worry about its 401k parent, you know, and the parents hopefully are taking into account their, in America, there's something called a 429 plan or 529. You invest in college education and the parents are helping train that baby. So the baby doesn't have to worry about it. Their parents are hopefully looking after them. So these are big challenges. And so what would be your response to these? So if someone said, you know, this is dumb, like, why are you doing this? Given this evidence, how do you justify yourself? Have any of you ever been challenged this way, and what do you say to someone? Okay, well, I'll tell you what I say, and it's not that oh yeah, I just reject, and I'm not going to do any work in this anymore. You know, this you know, we have to throw this, all this work has to be thrown out. Is that, you know, all models are approximations. And let me go to this quote that I like here. Well, I think I missed it here. Well, there's a guy named George Box. He's a statistician, and his have you ever heard of this? All models are wrong, but some are useful, right? So we know, you know, it's good to be aware that these models are wrong. These models are not literal. So I think about models as approximation theory, right? You know, in econometrics, we said, well, if your model's wrong, you have a misspecification. Oh my God, I'm going to estimate. But, you know, what we should be thinking about econometrics is approximation, is that you have a model, a non-expected utility model. I have an expected utility model. Maybe the proof in the pudding is which model does better in approximate behavior, and then doing out of sample counterfactual predictions. Which model works better in practice? They're both kind of not quite right. And so the way I think about why we do things is that right now at our current stage, it's still a challenge to do all of this behavioral economics kind of modeling. It's really cool they're developing it, but there's nothing as general and flexible as, you know, expected utility and time separable preferences, which is already a big challenge for us. But we can work with these models. We get a lot of really interesting predictions out of them, and we know they're not quite right, but they're just better than anything else we have right now. So that's why, that's what I would say, is that why we do it despite these serious challenges, and not to say that we shouldn't be working hard to overcome them with better models. Now, but if of all of these, I just think right now, the one I'm most interested in is how do we overcome the curse of dimensionality? And because, you know, again, we're coming back to the real frustration for me is the models are just always not as rich as I'd like them. I'd like to make them even more realistic. And that's always where I'm feeling frustrated, dissatisfied. And, but then if it's hard for us, you know, then you might say, how do people do this, right? And so if we can't solve it, then how is the average Joe out there able to get through life? And they must be, you know, it's really kind of a superior kind of view. Oh, if they, you know, we're so much smarter than the average Joe, they can't possibly be doing this theory because we can't solve what they're doing, right? But, you know, and so Herbert Simon recognized that this curse of dimensionality, didn't use that term, and he said that you know, this is already recognized in the 1950s, the middle 1950s, that a theory of bounded rationality had been proposed as an alternative to classical omniscient rationality, and a significant number of empirical studies have been carried out that show the actual business decision making. So he was focused on business decision making, but we could also substitute individual decision making as well, conform reasonably well to the assumptions of bounded rationality, but not with the assumptions of perfect rationality. Okay, so again, it's kind of an embarrassment, but and so this is Simon, you know, and you know, he's one of my heroes. I think Simon is an amazing guy. I got to meet him while he was still alive, and you know, he's in psychology. He's like a polymath, right? He had, you know, he worked in artificial intelligence. He was really a pioneer in artificial intelligence. So, you know, and particularly when you think about the number of decisions we can make at any given time, right? Like right now, I could just go out there and somersault into the pond and go swimming, right? That's a possible decision, right? Now, I'm not going to do that, but it's a possible decision I can make. You know, I move my hand, that's a decision, right? There's so many things we're doing in continuous time. It's just mind-boggling. Now, you might say, but that's kind of all irrelevant. We want to focus on the big picture. But how do we do it? How do we get up in the day, tie our shoes, take a shower, breakfast, all the things we do, organize our time? And apparently, if you talk to neuroscience, our brain only uses about 20 watts of power to do all this. Now, basically, they also have neuroscientists actually calculate how powerful is the human brain, and they try to, you know, translate our neural net into computer operations in terms of flops, floating operations per second. And some estimates now are that the brain is at least capable of, it's called a petaflop, 10 to the 15 floating point operations per second. And it does that only on 20 watts of power. And 20 watts for us is a lot of, you know, and biologically, it's about a third of our energy and oxygen's consumption are going to our brain. And so evolutionary was expensive for nature to evolve a brain, but the brain, you know, the power of the brain is so, it gives us such an advantage, it was worth it. So, but if you look at supercomputers that we're building that are capable of petaflop, they are like, they need as much energy as a small city. They're like rooms and rooms of servers, and they need hundreds of thousands of kilowatt hours per year to run. Just massive energy. So somehow nature has figured out unbelievable architecture to enable us to do all the things we do, so smart, so flexible. And so if you think about that, it's just awesome what we do every day. What the average Joe does is completely beyond us. And then you might start thinking, well, you know, maybe our neural nets are breaking a curse of dimensionality somehow, and nature's figured out how to do this. And so the assumption of unbounded rationality is not such a bad approximation. Okay, so you can go back, and I go back and forth on that, you know, and to me, this is this is really the frontier topic, is trying to kind of look at the insights from the brain to try to learn how to solve these problems better. And there's massive progress going on now in deep neural nets, right? And we'll try to talk about that toward the end of this week. And you know, Simone Scheidegger has a paper called Deep Equilibrium Nets, and there's just a lot of evidence now that deep nets are very, very effective ways of approximating that, you know, not in a provable sense break the curse of dimensionality, but they're very, very promising. So we're going to try to expose you to those as a way of doing this. So then, you know, Milton Friedman, he pushed the idea that, we don't literally pop out of the womb doing backward induction, but we still might act as if we had solved these things. Just like, analogies, if you're a pool player, you're a professional pool player, you're using a lot of physics, like the spin of the ball. There's something, angle of incidence equals angle of reflection, M times V equals F times T. They're learning, they're using physics. They may never have taken a physics course, but they're learning it empirically in using all this. So maybe we're learning the effect of dynamic programming as we go through our life. Our brains are just adaptive. So there's a whole literature in computer sciences called reinforcement learning. And what's really cool about reinforcement learning is it learns solutions to dynamic programs in a model-free way. In other words, we described that Bellman equation with a transition probably, and you had to know that. But in these reinforcement learning, you just have a smart agent that's adapting and learning over time, doesn't even really know that transition, but experiences rewards as they're going along. And if they are training long enough, they learn to behave optimally in what they call a model-free way through it's a stochastic convergent algorithm that learns optimal behavior in a very, and now there are certain assumptions to make that work. And there's a paper on this called asynchronous stochastic approximation by John Siklis. It's one proof of this Q. It's called Q learning. And we'll try to talk about that later, but it's just showing you that there's a lot of exciting things in the interface of machine learning, computer science, neuroscience, artificial intelligence that are all and economics, and economics is influencing this as well. So it's a very interesting period if you're interested in these things. So so I don't think it's crazy to use life cycle models. And again, George Box, all models are wrong. Some are useful, and I would say the life cycle models have been extremely useful, really, really useful, even though they're wrong. But they're generating a lot of insight. And finally, the other thing that what I do, why do I do this? I do this stuff because even just to discover what's purely rational is interesting in itself. What does the life cycle imply? And when we solve this, before we just write down life cycle models, but now we're solving them and getting a lot of insight and saying, wow, that's like really cool behavior that's coming out of these models. So we're learning about the theory as well as we're learning, we're confronting what theory predicts to what people do. And in the process, we're learning more about both of them, right? So that's Milton Friedman. So let's go to another issue. Are decisions discrete or continuous? So it's very common in life cycle models to see consumption is measured as continuous. You have a certain amount of wealth, a budget set, and here's the utility of consumption. And then this is your savings. This is what you're leaving over for next period. And that you make this continuous consumption decision. But when you think about consumption on a day-to-day, when you had breakfast, you decided to take some scrambled eggs and you might have had an orange juice. You might say, well, those are discrete decisions. It's a little bit fuzzy, right? How much scrambled eggs? Did you have a big scoop or a little scoop? You could say, how many grams of scrambled eggs did you put on your plate? So it's a little bit ambiguous, but maybe it's not such, there's no such, it's hard to think of decisions that are really best measured as continuous. So you have some choice here, and that flexibility we'll be talking about. Sometimes you want to do both. And so Fedor is going to be talking about a really fast algorithm for solving this continuous optimization called EGM, endogenous grid. How many people have heard of EGM, by the way? Yeah, so a lot of you, yeah, and it's very, very fast for solving this. But also when you have discrete choice like retirement, that's really, you can't really make that continuous really. And it's called the DSE, discrete choice EGM method. And the combined can be very, very effective. And the work with Mike Keene is using that method. And Mike will be talking about at the conference and then also in his lecture tomorrow morning, right? So these are, again, approximations, and we can choose them maybe a little bit more on convenience and what works. And we're still evolving on that. So now I'm going to go through some examples of life cycle models. And everyone talks about Ben Perath, that's some of the early work. And so let's just show you how simple some of these models are. So in terms of human capital, KT is a stock of human capital. It's a continuous time model. And then earnings is equal to just a proportion alpha naught times your human capital. More human capital, more earnings. And you can invest in your human capital. In this model, your consumption is whatever you don't invest in your human capital. And so the human capital has a production function, which is some fraction of your human capital, like study time. How much time, and the more human capital you have, the more effective your study time. So you devote some of your you use some of your human capital to produce more. And then you might spend on books, pay money to get a teacher or help. And so you have a Cobb-Douglas production for human capital production. And so then you have a differential equation where your increment in human capital is the human capital production, but there's some depreciation of human, I'm facing that, the memory problem, you forget stuff. And well, it happens at all ages, but you have depreciation of human capital. And so then you can think about this, you have an investment equation, and the objective then of the individual is to maximize, there's no shocks here, expected discounted earnings net of investments in human capital over a finite horizon. And so the early work, it was really before all this revolution in dynamic programming would use optimal control models. But it was still, very much, we can really recognize that as kind of a simple version of what we're doing now. Then look at Jim Heckman. He got his PhD from Princeton in 1974, and his thesis was on the lifecycle model at Princeton. And I think his thesis was published 2 years later in the Journal of Political Economy, a life cycle model of earnings, learning, and consumption. And his model is also in continuous time. And he has the utility function for consumption, leisure, and H is human capital. So he's got a multiplicative, so your leisure is more effective if you have more human capital. So you just have more fun. If you have more human capital, you're going to have more, greater effective leisure. And he has again, a law of motion. There's a depreciation. He calls it sigma. And so there's investment, and the investment is also more effective if you have more human capital, and you can spend money like Ben Perath. And then income is some rate of return on the human capital, similar to Ben Perath. So you see how Ben Perath's work was influential to Jim Heckman. And then there's an assets in the model, and the assets are interest rate on your savings, and then you have income minus the leisure. So this is how much you work, and then how much you spend on augmenting your human capital, and then what you spend on, in money terms to get like teachers or schooling, and then minus consumption. So then you have this, there's a bequest function, and you're maximizing, you want to, and he characterizes, again, using optimal control approaches, the solution to this problem. And he was trying early on to see how well this theory confronts the data. Now, this is some actual data on earnings. So one of the things they weren't really solving the full consumption trajectory, but here he's comparing the Ben Perath model and its life cycle trajectory of earnings to his augmented his version of the model, and then a quadratic, something that just fits the data without just like a reduced form model. And you might say, yeah, that looks promising, but his model seems to fit the data better than the Ben Perath model. Now let's talk about Robert Miller, who will be talking in a little while. And let's just make sure I have time. I don't want to run over on Bob's talk, but he's got a very cool paper in 1984 called Job Matching and Occupational Choice. And he formulates the job search problem as a multi-arm bandit, a Bayesian learning problem called the multi-arm. How many people have heard of the multi-arm bandit problem before? Yeah, a few people, okay. So let me explain how this works. It's very, very cool. You get a U is the wage or the utility. So you could think about it as net, including non-pecuniary benefits. Like maybe we get paid less as economists, but we have so much flexibility that that's also something we really value. So it's the net value of a profession. Whereas if you went to banking, I used to be in investment banking. I got paid a lot more, but I was, you know, the boss would tell me when to go and where to go, and it was much more stressful. And so he's assuming that when you're early, you know, think about early on, you don't know this, you're going to divide this into a transient shock. This is an IID shock to your payoff, your wage, you can think about it. And this thing is an unknown mean. So you see the sum of these two, but you don't know this. You have a prior. So you're a Bayesian and you have a normal, the shock is normal 0, 1, and you have a belief about this with a prior given by this. So you can think about D are different, like say occupations. Should I be a doctor? Should I be an economist? Should I be a skier, right? And what are the payout, an artist? And you think, if I'm an artist, there's a huge variability, about whether I'm going to be successful, maybe a lower rate of return. And when you start off life, you have these beliefs, and then you're going to go into the different occupations and then learn about them. So there's a Bayesian updating formula for this. So first of all, it's defined. This is the total amount of time you've been in occupation D. So you could say this is a measure of your human capital. How much time did D of S is the decision you made at time S. So this is just counting up how many periods up till now have you been in a given occupation? Like how long was I in investment banking before I switched into economics? And then by Bayes' rule, there's a posterior. So you had a prior on these things, and then you learn over time. These are just well-known Bayes' rule. The posterior is going to be normal. It's called a conjugate prior, and this will be the posterior mean. It's a weighted average of your prior mean, and then the actual outcomes. This is the average the average earnings that you got up till now on the times you were in investment banking, for instance. And here's a formula for the variance, and it's again some of your prior variance, but rated by how much observations you have. They're reducing this. Now, what you're trying to do is Bayesian decision problems are really, really hard in general because the posterior, in this case, it's a conjugate prior. It's within the normal family, but in general, a posterior distribution may not be with any parametric family. And when you have to just carry the entire distribution, it's an infinite dimensional state variable. So these are really, really hard problems to solve. But even when it's conjugate prior, this is a hard problem because you're trying to maximize and learn at the same time, right? So, you hear this term, in these problems capture the trade-off between exploitation and exploration, right? So, and maybe some of you had the same thing. You said you want to, you might think, I could make a lot of money in investment banking, but, I think I could be a great skier. Now, exploitation is staying in investment banking, making a lot of money, but what would really make me happy is being a great skier and being able to go skiing all the time. Should I try it? Should I leave investment banking and then try skiing for a while? And maybe, when you're young, that's what they say. Try skiing. See if you do it. You learn very quickly. If you don't, maybe you can go back to investment banking, right? So you're sampling and learning about your careers over time and finding where your best match is. And this can also be applied to individual jobs. Now, what it turns out to is my late thesis advisor, Martin Weissman, was working on this problem when I was at MIT. He called it Pandora's box because there's these boxes with rewards. They also call it a multi-armed bandit. There's a guy named Gittins who he kind of scooped Marty. It was unfortunate because they both had it, but Gittins got his paper out there first. And Marty was extremely, upset about it. He could, this is almost kind of Nobel Prize winning result. But what they both found out is that the optimal strategy is forms of a reservation price, which is a function of your posterior beliefs. And the reservation price can be expressed this way. It's kind of like a maximum, this is called the stopping time. It's the expected reward divided by discounted time. So you can think about it, expected reward per unit of time. So the reservation price of being a skier is what do I earn per period in skiing, assuming I only stay in skiing long enough before I optimally switch to whatever, back to investment banking. So what kind of reward can I get from skiing versus investment banking? And what you do is that, see, there's many careers. It's a multidimensional, but each one becomes unidimensional. This is like a unidimensional dynamic program. The soup is like a dynamic program. So you calculate these individual reservation prices, and then it's very simple. You just start out with whatever career has the highest reservation price. You go into that career, and as you're in that career, you're learning about it. So your posterior belief parameters are changing. And maybe you realize, man, this career, skiing is not what it is really cut out to be. And you realize, man, it's actually, I'm falling down all the time and I'm not getting paid very much. And the reservation falls. And then the next highest one is investment banking. Then you leave that and you go into investment banking. And then you're in investment banking until, maybe you realize investment banking isn't as good as it was. And then you say, teaching, that's what I really want to do. I'm going to be a teacher. And then you switch and you become a teacher. Okay, now Bob used this and he derived, this theory, and he derived a likelihood function. So he could derive from this theory, I won't go into all the details, a hazard rate, and it depends on this parameter alpha, which is a relation, it's the amount of the idiosyncratic noise to the prior variance. And so it's kind of an information factor, he calls it. And he can derive a hazard rate, the probability of leaving a given occupation. And then this gives you an unconditional density that you're going to be in that occupation for T periods. And from that, you can derive a likelihood. So it's a very clean, beautiful model where a very elegant theory leads directly to a likelihood that can be estimated. Okay. Now, let's go to Keen and Wolpen. I'll go through one or two more. I won't get through all my slides, but I will post them. And this is 10:26. I'm going to stop on time. But Keen and Wolpen is a really landmark, it's really highly cited paper. And, how many people have read Keen and Wolpen? Okay, so yeah, I won't have to spend a lot of time, but, it's a discrete choice model, and there's looking at people starting at 16, and they make one of 5 possible decisions: blue collar, white collar, join the military, attend school, or stay at home. And so then they say the utility is kind of basically equals the wage. Although again, you can think about the non-pecuniary, like maybe, the non-pecuniary benefits of a white collar job are higher. Blue collar, you get dirty, you get hurt. So it's not just the wage, it's other things. And then they have a simple model of human capital evolution, right? So XA of D is the amount of, GA is the total amount of schooling at age A. This is the amount of time you've been a blue collar, D, a blue collar or white collar or the military. So you have these separate counts of your time in each of these things. And you have a wage equation with an error term. This is like a log, if you take the log of this, it's going to be like a log linear wage equation. And it's a quadratic, there's a quadratic in experience. So this is like a typical Mincer human capital model, a wage equation. And so then in their model, they're trying to maximize their discounted utility over the lifetime. And there's not so much, there's learning in some sense, there's experience. It's not like Bob Miller in the sense that these human capital equations are known, all the coefficients are known. So it would be a Bayesian problem if you didn't know what those thetas are and you had to learn them. But in their model, they're assuming that the agents know these thetas, they know this wage equation. And then as they go through life, they're just trying to figure out what's the optimal sequence to maximize lifetime utility. And they found that this, and from that, when you solve this dynamic program, you get a choice probability, conditional choice probability, and then they formed the likelihood. Now, the reason I wanted to go through this is that in the Keenan-Wolpin model, they like to use normally distributed shocks. Okay, and if you look at their paper, they had to have an appendix. They had to use simulated maximum likelihood because when you use normally distributed shocks, computing this choice probability is involving doing an integral. So there should be just a density with respect to the, I'll correct that in here. But this is the optimal decision rule. It's a function of observed state and this unobserved shocks, which is a 5-dimensional normal distribution. And this function is not a closed form solution. So they have to numerically integrate this 5-dimensional integral just to get the choice probability for any given experience level. So there's a lot of work involved in this. And then solving the dynamic programming, the epsilons are also a state variable, and they have to compute what they call the Emax, the expected max function. And so it's just, it's a beautiful paper, but they went through a hell of a lot of work computationally just to do this. And this is back in 1997. So now I'm going to just compare this to a paper I did with Chris Phelan in 1997, looking at the other end of the life cycle, how Social Security and Medicare affect retirement in a world of incomplete markets. And what we're going to do here is we are going to make something that may be a sin in this literature. We're going to assume consumption equals income, because we're focusing on blue collar Americans who basically have very little more than their house. And if there's lots of Americans that are just living hand to mouth. They're living, they call it paycheck to paycheck. They aren't saving at all. It's a shocking thing, but Americans have, a lot of people, my generation baby boomers, they have almost no financial assets at all, no pension, and their only pension is really Social Security. So this is what we were focusing. We're looking at those kind of blue collar people who really, this is a pretty good approximation. Now, instead of just assuming it, it'd be better to get that to fall out. They could save. Why didn't they save? So why do they choose this instead of saving? And that's still a really good question, I think. I think it's really a good question about are Americans saving adequately for retirement? But we do have this, consumption equation. So it's hard to measure consumption also. We would try to back it out of the budget equation as a residual. But what happens is that wealth is very noisy. And so we can often get negative consumption because these, noise in this overwhelms what income drives this thing negative. But anyway, this is the kind of life cycle discounted utility problem we had in our problem. Everything's discrete, right? So there's just labor supply, which is discrete, and retirement is discrete. Now, let me just show you, I'm a student of Dan McFadden. So here's the human capital I picked up from Dan McFadden. Don't use normal, use the extreme value, okay? All right, makes life so much easier. Now, the thing is that these are for computational reasons, right? Do you really think the shocks are normal versus, probably neither, These are just models. But if we're going to make a model and, it's not that the normal and the extreme are so much different from each other, and it's just so much easier to do it this way, why not do it this way? But I think Keenan and Wolpin are a little bit stubborn. We were working around the same time. They could have done it my way. I think they just didn't want to do it. They had it their way. They wanted, so there's an alternative out there. But let me show you, this is the extreme value distribution, learned it from my thesis advisor. And what you do is we're going to make two assumptions, additive separability, and that's this, the error term here is additively separable from the utility function, and then conditional independence. So the conditional independence assumption is that there's a joint probability for this error term, that's part of the state, and then the X, the part where you do observe, and we're going to say that decomposes into this thing, the extreme value, and then this thing that only depends on X's, things that we can observe. And when we do this inner integral is going to have a closed form. So this is the Emax. See, this value function is a max over different choices. And when you talk about the Emax, you're taking the expectation, and that thing's going to have a beautiful closed form solution, no multivariate integration. And furthermore, the choice probabilities that we have here with respect to this density will have this very beautiful logit formula here, closed form solution. So 2 problems, major computational problems solved. Now, it doesn't mean that we still have computation. We still have the observed state variable. We still have to do this one. We haven't gotten out of that one. But this inner one, the Emax, it's very nice and smooth. And Bertel and Fader and I were using this in a big way. We'll be talking about an auto equilibrium model with many types of agents. And you can layer on additional heterogeneity. So you have the extreme value, but there's something called mixed logit, where you mix over other kinds of parameters. And even though logit itself has got this IIA problem, when you have mixed logit, you can, McFadden showed it's like a neural net. It can approximate any choice probability. So these are some of the computational tricks that allow us to solve these things much faster than we could. And then we're getting better and better all the time. So I'm going to stop here and just say we'll be learning more about this, but I just tried to give a little bit of an overview about where things stand.
Great, thank you, John. So in a hybrid mode, we're still learning, and we saw one question coming in a little bit too late. Let me see whether I remember it correctly. It was whether the multi-arm bandit problem and the Pandora problem are the same. I didn't.
Yeah, they're the same, just different names. Yes, Marty Weitzman, and he called it Pandora. If he would have been first to publication, it would be called the Weitzman reservation price rule. But now it's called the Giddens Index.
All right, great.